There's one thing about lecturing in university context is that it immediately provides you with something to rage against. I mean, the gentility of the walls kind of spurs something. I remember the first time I lectured in Cornell. I lectured in this hall, and when I arrived by the hall, there was this display, this case display. And in this display, there were these jars with brains in it. And that came from the fact that a teacher in the 1900 was one of the last remnant passionate of phrenology guys, and he had persuaded the various teachers of the university to will their brain to the university. So there were a series of brains in these jars, and next to the brain there was a little pamphlet with the publication of the brains. I thought, well, it was basically what would happen to me. I mean, one fashion or another. So, what are we going to talk about? Well, a bit of maybe about my itinerary. We called ourselves the Dziga Vertov group at a moment where nobody was thinking about Dziga Vertov, where the name was basically absolutely unknown, and where the name, so we called ourselves that for two reasons. One, there was certainly a certain type of respect, rage against Eisenstein and its dominance over Soviet cinema. But what was interesting about Vertov for us was the fact that it's the first in the history of cinema. He's really absolutely unique. I mean, unique in the sense that he's the first person to have thought about what we call media today. That's the real line of demarcation in terms of Vertov, i.e., a capacity for filmmaking to stop being that kind of provincial medium that constantly paid tribute to a certain type of rather idealistic phenomenology of the image, but including a whole range of graphic production that served not only at propelling the discourse, but also at constantly reframing it. I.e., what was interesting about Vertov, which very few people ultimately, even in their analysis of his aesthetic, show, is that he was interested in a type of discourse that constantly called upon the image to situate itself both politically and philosophically. And that implied collecting. So among other things, one of the elements of transformation is that he went against the idea of documentary. And he foregrounded an idea which is different, which is the idea of documentation as an active act of dramatically collating and organizing information. And in that sense, he's completely in advance on his time. In that sense, he's the first one to have pointed out the fact that maybe just at that point, and in his theoretical text, in his pamphlets, and a lot of his theoretical texts are pamphlets, they're science fiction, they're political science fiction, they're projection on what might happen to the image. He basically stated, or he basically understood, that information was going to become the essential dramatic notion. Now, we got into that at a point where you have to understand, and it's not been analyzed yet, that as an effect of a whole series of political and intellectual sedimentation, the period was a period of glacial age that mirror that period of, in terms of aesthetic, mirror that period of the Cold War. What existed as quote-unquote political cinema was in fact something that had been solidified around the 1930s and reactivated as a kind of either social realism and on the Soviet side, or social political realism but it was somewhere in between Stalinist films, which people like Joris Ivens in some way was a good friend embodied, and something which went back to Salt of the Earth and the plow that broke the plane and all this stuff that they say. So basically there was this stuff and in that sense the political cinema of the left was also anticipating on something. It was anticipating retroactively. And the one thing that is complicated about the period I come from, which is called the 60s, which is a period under which people of your age suffer quite a lot because most of the motherfuckers that are teaching you are coming from there. And they're coming from there, and they're coming from there with the stated will to repress, which is always the drama of every generation that try to change something. So the one thing that was totally I mean, the one thing about my generation, I go back, you gotta understand that 3/4 of the time I take this light detour and I come back. Don't worry, by the end of the 2 hours you'll understand what I'm talking about. We're a generation that really thought that in some ways we were going to carry the torch and go into the future and reactivate. There was a lot in the 60s of reactivation of all types. Returns to Freud, returns to Marx. On one end, Lacan, the other Althusser. I'm talking about my teacher. And somewhere in the middle, dancing this kind of strange queer dance was Foucault, okay? But basically what was at stake was this idea that we were our eyes on the prize and the future. We didn't realize that in fact what we were was some giant Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. That we were in fact working backwards and we were essentially the grave diggers of something that had solidified, occupied, jailed intellectual lives since the 1920s. And among other things, and it was even far more present in France and in Europe than in the States, it was Marxism and its avatars. And in that sense, however much we look backward, in some ways, and at the same time we had the illusion to go forward, it's also in that mechanism, something also was anticipated by the people like Jean-Luc Agny wanted to defeat. And what it was the fact that the terror, I'm talking about the terror in the 1792 sense of the terror. I'm talking about the French Revolution, I'm talking about Robespierre, I'm talking about the terror as politics. The terror of content was upon us. So 1968, 1972, the moment where Jean-Luc and I worked, is really a key moment. The kind of films that we did, and it's very interesting because I just had, for some absurd reason, as I was saying yesterday, I've had, in the last 2 months, like 2 retrospectives, so I've been forced to look at my own work since the beginning. So the one thing that's centered to our stuff is that we really think that there is something at stake, okay? And that, what is at stake is to force filmmakers or to force cinema to re-examine its ideological underpinning. And it's at the moment where the political circumstances are exploding so greatly that in fact the old ideology, the old ideology which comes from the 1930s, which focuses on content, which wants to always go there and document reality, despite the fact that there is a technology that is in concurrence with, which is the ideology, the technology of video and television. Okay, this idea that content is primary in matters of politics is right there, and we're the only ones to yell and to say, no, it's form. Form and content, I mean, it's like this ridiculous stuff about form and content redebated around 1968. Vertov on that level became a key figure because he is precisely somebody who makes all these dichotomies that built the history of cinema absolutely be blown to smithereens. So, you're going to say, you're beautiful, you come back, you have survived, and you lie to your teeth, because if we look at your films and the films that you did then, they're braying the Marxist credo like crazy. Absolutely. You know, one of the great glories of my life is people generally address me as the man who's known the man. The man being Godard, which exists with this extraordinary weight in the imaginary of critics and viewers alike. I mean, he's the only filmmaker in the history of cinema that had his public called himself by his first name. People don't say Mr. Godard like they say Mr. Renoir, Mr. Lang. They call him Jean-Luc, as if it was like your little brother or some sort of super friend, ego that was there. Okay, so Jean-Luc worked very hard at being called Jean-Luc. He even made a film called JLG versus JLG. Why the fuck did I get into that? It seemed that you could question cinema, and that whatever it was, you know, you had to drop a certain number of categories. Why? As I said yesterday, because it was a long time past the moment where cinema was interested with the world. Cinema had left Lumière in some ways, or Griffith. Since that train had entered the railroad station, it had left. And this idea that images were images of the world had been transformed, and images were nothing else but images of images. They were constantly the reproduction or the alteration, incremental or not, of codes of vision which were essentially political. I.e., to look at something is to define politically what that thing is. We weren't that innovative in saying that. In some ways, that's what Foucault was talking about. That's also what Althusser was talking about, etc., etc. Okay? But it was interesting for us to interrogate the ways of seeing, and to try to define them. And it had consequences in terms of political cinema. Because if what we said was quote-unquote right, it meant that there was not one possibility to make political cinema, but several. And that those codes of vision would constantly evolve. So the reference to Marxism in its latest avatar, which was Maoism, was just that. Meaning by that, it was just one of the ways in which certain things could be located at that moment and nothing else. It wasn't, as it was deciphered, a moment of great creed by which, like some sort of mad ayatollahs, we were trying to persuade the world that this was the true path. It was kind of interesting because those films were produced by television, which was one of the first series of film which evolved in that mode of production, which didn't exist before. They were produced on a kind of illusion. I mean, it was like always a kind of carte blanche given to Godard and myself then to do what we did for benefiting from the idea of the grid, which totally determined the way things are produced in television, and for a public that would stay alive late at night for very little money. But that wasn't our problem. We always made our film for half of the money that we were paid for. An example, we did a film which came straight out of the work that I'd done with Althusser on the establishment of a text that he wrote, which was called On the Ideological Apparatus. And the film was called Struggle in Italy. Why? Because we got this kind of carte blanche to talk about the Italian solution, the Italian situation. The film was shot for half of the money that we were given. It was shot in Jean-Luc's apartment. The main actress was a friend of ours who was Italian. The main male actor was a guy who was working at the pizza downstairs. And when we needed him for a scene, we would order pizza and he would come up. And the pizza ended up by the end of the shooting stacking up in various state of decomposition, stacking up in the bathroom. It was absolutely hilarious. And then we went with 2 Super 8 cameras for 2 days to shoot various people passing in the streets, and we did our film. We did a lot of stuff which hasn't been seen, which was part of our activity. We did tracts, leaflets, which were done in Super 8 and projected on the faces of buildings and factories. We did a series of we had a 6 o'clock news that we shot in my kitchen and in Jean-Luc's kitchen, where we had just a desk and we played anchor, and we just created news, which are all false and at the same time quite funny. And the stuff was shown in a library. I mean, there was the time where video was still very cumbersome. So that exists somewhere. We did a film which I like very much for the Ministry of Tourism of Mexico, which was we got the gig through Jean-Luc's sister, who was working for that ministry in Mexico. We shot it in Jean-Luc's bathtub. With a friend of ours. I mean, we made it believe that it was some resort near Acapulco. We painted this stuff completely. And we even did a thing which was kind of strange. I mean, we got. I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to say next, so we get an anecdote. There was this guy from Young and Rubicam who fell in love with us, and he gave us large amounts of money over a period of 12 months. We were supposed to do only one, our contract was we would do one commercial. And it was absolutely hilarious because we would see the guys would be paid very large amounts of money. Believe me, I wish I would be paid like that now. And we would come to Young and Rubicam, and there were all these suits around the table, and they would propose us commercials, and they would self-destruct because suddenly it turned into this insanity when a guy would propose that we do a commercial on cheese, and another guy would expose saying, "Godard and cheese, you're crazy." And then we would take our check and disappear. But by the 11th month, we still had to do one commercial. So they gave us a commercial of Chic After Shave. And the storyboard was completely done. And the story was kind of simple. It was a guy who was waking up, shaving, cutting himself, getting pissed, having a tiff with his girlfriend. And then he went into the bathroom, he put Chic After Shave, and the world became rosy. It was black and white and then color. So we shot that in one morning with a friend of ours was this great actress named Vertov, who was in the Chinese and in Weekend, and since then died. And another friend was really, truly the ugliest guy I've ever seen in my life. And we pushed everything a little much. So instead of cutting himself with rivers of blood, instead of having a tiff, he was taking a baseball bat and beating her up to the pulp. And finally, when he splashed this thing, it turned into some sort of strawberry. And they never showed it. I mean, but then they finally decided to put it in a festival for commercial, and we got the first prize for aftershave commercial. I wish I had this thing. Anyway, back to the serious stuff. So all the films which are very different are basically films in which, beyond the ideological discourse of the moment, there is this idea that you're going to question cinema itself. That's why they don't have the. I mean, it was obvious that a lot of other peoples were doing the living stuff, documentation of the glorious struggles of various groups. We were basically constantly talking about the practice, and that's why the films kind of stick together. Now, shift to America. Essentially, all my stuff comes from one reading of one phrase of Fritz Lang. And that phrase is that Fritz Lang said that a film of fiction only achieves the true power of fiction when it becomes a documentary. And if you look at M, or if you look at a lot of his films, it's an absolute illustration of that. And it's a very, very smart way to undercut this rather idiotic dichotomy between fiction and documentary, between fiction and non-fiction. So basically, I was coming from that place where I'd worked with a man who had made a profession to make films where he's constantly moping about the impossibility of telling a story. I had a furious desire to tell a story. And it seemed to me that, in fact, a documentary was, or quote unquote, what was documentary, was a good place to start. And then I could invert the proposition of Fritz Lang and just simply ask myself, is it the case that a documentary becomes only a documentary when it achieves a kind of fictional space? And essentially all the films that I did were about that. So they're not different from the films done with Godard, but in one respect. They're not different in the sense that it's always about the multiplication, the use of an extraordinary amount of material, which by the fact that it is on the screen is and should be qualified as an image. So an image can exist on a curve. It can be a degree zero. It can be an absence of an image. It can be a black space. It can be a graphic on the screen. It can be an image, as it's called. It's images. I mean, imagine a curve. Imagine an image existing in a liquid, gaseous, solid state, and a film being that transmutation over time of the reality of the image. The advantage of that is that, and that was a development of the stuff that we've done with Jean-Luc and that Jean-Luc had started, which is a kind of all-encompassing approach. Any visual sign can come into the film. Okay, so that approach has an effect, which is that by force, if you do that, you are what that condemns you to be, which is not a bad position. You're an editor. The directors come in all sorts of shapes and forms, and they define themselves by the fact that they give more or less emphasis to one aspect of the craft over the other. And Jean-Luc is certainly an editor, and I'm certainly an editor in that respect. So why document? So, you know, it seemed to me that documentaries were really about, they were far more so than fiction. They foregrounded the maker. You know, it was about somebody having a discourse about people and facts. And it was a discourse which was complex because, among other things, it had an ethical dimension. And how do you talk about people? I mean, you can't simply, you know, to the risk of being yourself an asshole, you can't call them an asshole. So you don't have, you constantly, in the case of the documentary, or the aspect of documentation, you constantly, not limited, but you have to deal with this notion of respect. And how do you deal with that notion? And you can most documentaries deal with it by deciding that the only way to answer it is a geography. You know, they exist in a position of kneeling beatifically in front of their subject. And to me, that's a cop-out, because the problem is the range. The problem is you might be in front of a saint, but at one point in the discourse of the film, in the making of the film, the saint might be a serious pain in the ass. So how do you give range? How do you give range in terms of both the reality of the subject that you are looking at and the reality of the emotions that you, the maker, experience in your relationship to the subject? And to me, it was absolutely obvious that the only way to do that was to to build myself as a kind of fictional element in the discourse of the film itself. I.e., the only way I could give the audience the possibility to ultimately judge or exist, you know, was not to hide behind the subject and its grandiousness or its emotionality or its, you know, most documentaries, I mean, take guys like Ken Burns, who really could put to sleep anybody who is in his right mind, okay? But rules like Stalin, okay? Because that's the thing that you have to see. Those kind of guys are absolutely fucking repressive in relationship to any type of cinema that goes against their vision of things. A guy like Ken Burns, quote unquote, disappears behind the greatness of the subject. It's totally boring, but, you know, he can talk about Jack Johnson, or he can talk about baseball player, or he can talk about the Civil War. It absolutely constantly exists. It's a drone. It's constantly exactly the same thing. So you have to have the audience capable of looking at the material and taking a position against the material. You have to run that risk. You have to run the risk of your utterances. Yeah. So I decided to put myself in there. You know, what is myself? It's not me. You know, it's a construction. It's a narrative pole of reference. It's somebody telling you and laying out on you how he thinks, which, you know, in the case of the filmmaker is very practical. It's how I do things. So it becomes very important that one sees the acts of manipulation. I mean, to me, it might be limited, but the idea of work is work because what you see on the screen is work, because it sweats. So it becomes essential. How do you translate that? Well, it becomes essential that the filmmaker as an agent of manipulation be foregrounded, and it becomes essential that the manipulation be obvious, formally defined and obvious and articulated. So it becomes interesting if what you do is you multiply the entries and the exits in the material. So it's not simply a matter of design. It's a matter of making a film in which a lot of elements which do not have the same density, which do not float at the same speed, which are not made of the same things, get collated. And it becomes essential, contrary to most documentary, which, as I said, do this. I start from a mass of information and go to a point of elucidation, that in fact the stuff does this. It takes an entry as limited as possible, and it diffracts from there. I.e., that the documentary is this kind of network that starts to proliferate, so that, among other things, what is given to you when you do that is this idea that it's like the real itself. There is not one order of elucidation possible, but a multiplicity of orders of elucidation. That goes back to my childhood. I mean, I invented, in France, when you're a kid, they make you do these dissertations. They're like compositions on various subjects. So a problem is always, you're confronted with the idea how you gotta fucking finish the goddamn thing. And I had found the perfect solution, which was to end up every dissertation that I wrote, and I did that for years after years, by the following phrase: but it's late and my mother is calling me for dinner. And to me, one, because I had a Jewish mother, so I was hoping that everybody would understand the terror of that. And two, because it anchored the thing in something existential. And three, because it simply stated that there was not one fucking answer to be given, but it was to be continued and to be followed, which is the absence of image to the image as qualified from, in every discourse ranging from John Ford or Griffith to Stan Brakhage. And ultimately, the idea that any film is a machine, and that one of the way in which a film is political is to precisely have and entertain with its audience machine-type effect. I became a filmmaker because I saw at age, I think 15, a film by two filmmakers who are now dear friends of mine, and totally nuts, Jean-Marie Straub and Daniel Huillet. Since at least 2 or 3 decades, all their films look exactly the same. It's cheap togas and erratic position. When I saw that film, the film was a film called Not Reconciled, Niche Verzon. And I didn't understand a word of what this film was about. But something strange happened, which was that by the end of the film, I was persuaded that I spoke German. And it seemed to me that a medium that could persuade you that you spoke a language which wasn't yours, which a medium worth investing your entire life in. And in fact, I was at Vienna with Straub, and I told him, I said, at the end, this is still the best definition of political cinema that I know of. Something that makes you believe that you speak a language that you in fact do not know. Okay? So that's the kind of film I'm trying to do. Here it took this kind of silly idea to go to a place where nobody would dare make film from, which is San Diego. That's motivated by the fact that I met someone who I met, in fact, in Berkeley. It was Manny Farber, who persuaded me that you could be both the most radical and the most reactionary at the same time, the greatest painter and the greatest writer, that you could understand as well John Ford and Michael Snow, and that you could establish some sort of continuity between two, and on top of that, establishing this kind of thing, which was, I thought, absolutely essential in order to understand what was happening in the 60s is the moment in which the reference for a filmmaker stopped being literature in all its form, but started being painting. So that, the idea of the painterliness of the cinema of the 60s is the great theoretical find of Manny. And I did what I did, which is maybe I should show you that. But I think I should show you something else first. Horrible situation. You make film, they follow you like mongoloid children, drool all over the place. You like them, but it's always a little embarrassing. And also, most filmmakers are incredibly ungenerous in the sense that they're there to sing in an acrid fashion their own praise. And I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in cinema, so it might be interesting to show you a film which I think talks my language. It's not a film that I've done. It's not a film that I discovered myself. It's a film that I discovered because a dear friend of mine, to whom, among other things, I owed the fact that after my, the first film that I made here, which is Coro and Cabango, is a film which is everybody's supposed to love. And I succeeded. Everybody loves that film. It hasn't moved. It's a very charming film. And this person who will remain unnamed happened to be Elise Kramer. When she saw Coro and Cabango, grumped about it and said, you've given up. So I decided that I wasn't going to do this film, any more film that was going to obviously aim at having people take me back to their mother and say, look, it's so charming, I should marry him. But I was going to make a film which was going to be as dry as a dry toast, which is the film that some of you might look at, which I think is by far the greatest film that I've done at this point, which is Routine Pleasure, which is really the film that if you qualify films as, there's people who talk about UFOs, and I think what I do is UVOs, unidentified visual objects. And because Edith had said this is crap, this is giving up, I decided to make films about guys who run trains on time, model trains on time. Jesus, who wants to finance this thing like that? And this is drama as... But anyway, it's a great film. So Edith, who put me in this film, and Routine is a film that took me 5 years to do, Edith called me like a year or so ago, and she said, well, you should look, I'm sending you a film, you should look at it. And it's a film called The Trial, which is made by an Iranian guy named Muslim Mansouri, who has this particularity as an Iranian filmmaker to spit on every Iranian filmmaker that is now considered as God, be it Kiarostami or Makhmalbaf, who obviously has an history of being severely politically repressed. I don't know exactly on which side of the political divide in Iran, but he made this film which I want to show you. It has the advantage of being a perfect illustration of the stuff that I talk about. And it's a film that people don't see, and it's a film that I think is a great film. There are the films that you say, shit. But there's films that you see as a filmmaker, and you say, shit, I wish I had done that. Films that make you jealous. It's a film that makes me jealous. You have to know. You see from the get-go, from the moment where that buzz enters in green, and then enters again in blue, and then enters again in red. And you see that in every way in which this film is shot. And in fact, it's a purely fictional machine. There's absolutely no way to vouch for the fact that this is grounded in any kind of reality. So in a way, the problem that gets displaced is this idea which is inherent to documentary, that what justifies the documentary is somewhat the extraordinarity of the subject presented. But at the same time, this machine that you see constructed in front of you, that in fact shows you shots which obviously were staged, moments of portraiture, shot, reverse shot within an action, etc., etc. I mean, all the mechanics of the cinema, filming this character who basically bringing you back to the very origin of cinema, because what you see here is as close to Max Sennett or Griffiths as it gets. You get a machine that in fact has an enormous power as a carbon dating machine, which I think is really what political cinema is about. It's about looking at the specificity of a time and a moment and dating it. So that, and that is impossible, and you learn ultimately tons of stuff. You learn about relationship between daughters and brothers. You learn about relationship between women and men. You learn about you learn about the difference between what is called what is folk art versus corporate art. And suddenly what becomes completely put in perspective is this notion, which is in fact very modern, of what we call popular culture, which is in fact corporate culture. And the replacement of popular culture. And there's a character in this film that you guys might have recognized if you're familiar with Iranian cinema, which is the guy who acts as the Sabzian, the guy who acts as the production coordinator, is the guy who was the central character of the Kiarostami film called Close-Up. And that last phrase, where I cut, of course the film is shown and the film breaks apart, and at the end you end up with kids doing dogs and cats as Chinese shadows on the projection on the screen. But that last phrase, which is so brilliant about we hang from the gallows of cinema, which is basically an absolutely brilliant definition of the century in terms of its relationship to image making. All the enormous amount of information that you learn, and it has, to me, the most incredible homage to Godard you can ever see. This guy in the ecstatic position on his back, anything with that little pair of scissors. What wells on the screen, under the screen, is the music of Pierrot Le Fou, if I'm not mistaken. It's absolutely brilliant. The scene with the sound where they're mixing the stuff. So, I don't think my films are very different from that. An emphasis on showing the ropes, an emphasis on the multiplications of the takes of the material, a constant displacement across genres, an absolute refusal to be pigeonholed in the dichotomies that have established most of film history and most of film studies, an interest in the form. I.e., what's remarkable in this film is the fact that it's a film which is about reframing constantly. You're reframing a reality that's already been framed. There's two filmmakers dialoguing, so that it's important to. Cinema was always, in terms of what is it? It's simple. It's ocular gymnastics. You know, it's you try to. I mean, you know, the curse of cinema is the curse of D.W. Griffith. You know, it's this idea that in some ways you always land on the close-up, which is the moment where the screen becomes both expressive and neutral, and that the stuff that's interesting is creating distortions of space, i.e. avoiding the center as long and as much as you can. And that the act of filming is exactly in this sustained avoidance of the center, which ultimately collapses upon itself. i.e. you avoid the close-up so that you can go to the close-up, and the avoidance of the close-up is ultimately the creation of duration. You know, that film has very little to do and everything to do with painting, but it has certainly an enormous amount of relationship to music on that level, and the establishment of duration. And that in that process, all sorts of things are effectively proposed to you as elements of reflection. You know, what is a texture? What do we call materiality? You know, when I say, you know, not only, I mean, when I say that political film is a film that enables you to understand that you can speak a language that you in fact do not speak, a great film is something, I mean, I don't know. You know, if I make a film that really satisfies me totally, I suspect I will be able to do one thing that I've only seen one filmmaker be able to do. And that is Renoir in a film called Night at the Crossroad, where suddenly you enter a room and you smell something. So that suddenly, you know, there's this stuff that happens. I don't know, very few filmmakers have given me the idea that it smells something. You know, that you get. A lot of filmmakers have given me the sense that, in fact, the eye was listening. That's fairly easy to achieve. But the fact that the eye would smell, you know, confusion of the senses, and reconfiguration of your own body geography in relationship to the screen. And all the kind of mechanical, intellectual mechanisms that gets inclined. I mean, you know, it's very obvious that the engagement of film into the digital, you know, I mean, for me, like physically, you know, I love editing. I shoot very fast because I don't like shooting. It's not very pleasant. Some people love shooting. I don't necessarily, but I love editing. I love to be like a mole in the dark and looking. And I suffer from, you know, as much as I was talking to Trina about it, you know, as much as I'm grateful to Final Cut Pro, I hate it by the same token. I hate not to be like a small. I hate not to be able to lick things, to stitch things. I don't like the absence of physicality in which the digital takes us. Blah blah blah. Why don't you ask me questions? I mean, I feel like that. In some ways, I don't want to show my films. I don't know why. I've seen them too many times. You guys should look at them. They're great films. No, they're really great films. I mean, you know, there's absolutely no doubt about it. I mean, this is not patting myself on the back. They're among the best films you'll ever see. But to talk about them, for me to talk about them and persuade you that they're great is not very interesting. So open up and let's talk. Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about this idea you have about the close-up as the source of duration, and can you define a little bit more duration as opposed to the temporality?
if you look at the close-up, okay, the close-up creates an effect of enforced centrality. Okay, you have an object or a figure that is at the center of the screen. It's basically everything becomes like a target. Okay, so what happens at that centrality? If you look at it, oh, great. The blackboard, a fantastic invention. That's the close-up. What happens in that? What happens in that is this space equal this space equal this space equal this space. Either space becomes neutral. Okay. So there's obviously whom you're on it. So there is a conclusive aspect and a pornographic aspect to the close-up. Whether in the gesture to center like that, that's essentially the gesture that porn cinema has made the essential element of its aesthetic. You go as fast as possible to the genitals where the action is supposed to happen. So before that, you have shots, the long shot, the medium close-up, etc., that are where you don't have that neutrality of the space, where you have essentially the way they're established. They tend to avoid the center, and that's John Ford. That's the equation of John Ford. You go to Monument Valley, and you say, "My God, how could they film that much space?" And then you see a film of John Ford, and you realize that it's fairly simple. At one point, he puts in the foreground an element which is small enough to enable you to measure the immensity of the space that he frames. It's a cactus, it's the line of a corral, it's wagons crossing the screen, it's one figure, etc., etc. So what you create in most stuff before the close-up, you create effects where constantly you have distortion of the space. So you play at maintaining that distortion as long as possible till you're obliged to go to the close-up. So that's why I'm saying the close-up is both, it's effectively true that when D.W. Griffith came up with that beauty, he invented narrative cinema. But contrary to what people think, it's not simply that he invented cinema because he invented the close-up. He invented a system of desire and avoidance of the close-up, which is far more complicated than simply saying, and bang, he landed on Lillian Gier's face and everything came into play. No, it's the fact that the space was distorted, the space became malleable, the eye could be moved around in an effort of decipherment, hierarchies were established, and time was created because that enabled time to be created as layered, complex, etc., etc. So filmmakers tend to, or when film existed, because it's not obvious that it still exists, filmmakers tended to play that game. Well, it becomes very obvious that there's a whole series of forces, this is not neutral, there's also a series of forces that are going to be at work in the socius, in the ideological space, to enforce that, to enforce centrality, to enforce, because that is what, ads, publicity, industrial films, etc., etc. Television are doing. Television is this kind of neutral space which is constantly centered. And the stuff that has happened in the 60s is really suddenly two specific apparatuses, visual ideological apparatus become extremely activated. One is television, and the other is porn. Why do we look fascinated, for years did we look fascinated at the toupee of Ted Koppel? It's essentially because it looked like a beaver in a porn movie. That the fact of centering something like that and establishing the fact that a space that only at the center the content could be created, and the devaluation of the visual that goes with it, is the stuff. Look at any Hollywood film that you see now. They are, even if they do not apparently deal or are involved in sex, they're essentially pornography. You're looking at big centering machines. And it has extraordinary effect. You cannot speak about actors those days. An actor is a face, Mr. DeMille, where is I'm ready for my close-up. An actor is a close-up. What does that mean? That means that the actor is a potted plant. It's amputated from his body. If you think about any of the great American actors who are not young men and never presented as young or young women or etc., Wayne, whoever, Wayne Stewart, Cagney, etc., they have bodies. And the phenomenons of distortions and play with space is always about that idea that the body exists as a vehicle, as an element of the construction of the narrative, and that the actor is there to embody literally the narrative. I.e., the actor is a scaling machine in action. You see that when you look at compare two scenes like Lillian Gish in the closet in not Way Down East, but Chinky, Why You're So Good to Me, Broken Blossom. One of those quintessential racist paradigms of American cinema. Okay, in the closet with battling Belden, the brute of a father, about to beat her up to a pulp. The entire motion of the body is about scaling that closet. It's not about simply being centered on the mimicry that would emanate from that extraordinary expressive face. It's about how that motion creates the space around it. The closest thing that you have in modern cinema is De Niro on the billiard table in Mean Street. It's about a body moving in a reduced space. That has completely disappeared. I'm absolutely persuaded that in 3/4 of the Hollywood film, the way they keep the budget low is not to give pants to their actors. There's no need. It happens there. Yeah. So, but to say that is not simply to say, oh my God, it's about the deficiency and the stupidity of the people who make films now. No, it's political. This idea of living in a world where centrality is constantly the form that is enforced is a political statement. It has political consequence. It has intellectual consequences, etc., etc. And in some ways, one has to try to define what they are. Not by simply saying those films are terrible, but by trying to create films that act differently. And I'm not sure that they necessarily have to be created in this day and age as film. One of the things that seems very at stake right now is the fact that you have a medium that has absolutely no relationship whatsoever with film, which is the digital medium, which is still thought by most of its practitioners as film light, which is utter bullshit. It's not an easy way or an easier way to make films. It's another medium. An image defined, a film image, think about it. It's just as ancient as the bas-relief of ancient Egypt. It's three layers of chemical on an acetate support marked by light and creating illusions of depth. That's a very different idea of an image which is formed by intersection and point and lines. Now, so the type of depth that you could create with the digital is by force of a very different nature than the type of depth that you can create by film. And a guy like Godard is not a slouch, believe me. He's still the fastest kid on the block at age 70, 72 or 73, except that our music I have my problems with. But yeah, because in our music, if you think about it, the only position that he leaves to the viewer is to be the dog that followed the casket of Mozart. And it's burial. Jean-Luc has gone into such extraordinary length of perfecting his myth that now is his own mourning machine. And you look at our music, and at the end of it, you have to say, well, if this is the culture that we are mourning, so be it. But Jean-Luc rethought the problem of the digital in a simple fashion. He established that one of the problems of cinema, which is something that he was able to understand because he was so much involved in the idea of bringing, by editing, heterogeneous material into the filmic flow, so that the film was objectively, taking and demonstrating its reality. I mean, anybody who films knows that when you make a scene, even if you're making the most classical narrative scene, you're putting together pieces of film that have nothing to do with each other. That a long shot is not lit in the same fashion that a close-up is lit, and that there is between the two elements, there is 5 hours that pass, and that what you're putting together is a construct. It's not a flowing space. Jean-Luc started from that reality, and he said, well, if it's heterogeneous, let's make it heterogeneous. That's all his genius. Now, among other things. But, yeah, let me finish this one and then I get to it. But, when he thought about the digital, he thought about it in terms of saying, well, the problem of cinema has always been the singularity of the film image. And he thought about that because effectively what in the 60s became the prevalent mode for filmmakers of thinking about cinema, which was painting. Before that, it was all about literature, high, low. Okay. At one point, some people started thinking, and why did they think? Why did they start? I mean, think about it. And Jean-Luc is a very good example of that. Why did they start abandoning thinking about literature and started thinking about painting? First, because they saw themselves in reference to literature. All the guys of the 60s come out, and the new wave guys come out of this idea, the camera stylo, the camera as pen, the authorship of the filmmaker as authorship of the writer, okay? But Jean-Luc is simply a guy who said, well, why should it be constantly modeled on Balzac and Dickens? Why shouldn't it be Joyce, or why shouldn't it be Montaigne, or why shouldn't it be Raymond Chandler, or this, or that, or the other? And by doing that, he literally propelled cinema outside of literature into painting. Why? Because if you don't have the same kind of symphonic organization of the narrative, you then have a kind of fragmentarization of the scene that equates the scene in the way you view it and read it as to a painting. Jean-Luc is a guy who ultimately didn't know how to, was very persuaded of one thing, which was Wittgenstein's idea that if you don't know how to do it, there's no need to do it. What you can't think about, there's no need to think about. It's all over Wittgenstein. He was persuaded of that. So he knew that there were certain things he couldn't do, and he didn't try to do them. Okay? And as such, he suddenly decided, and he explained it to me. I mean, he didn't know how to light. Okay, so how did he think about that problem? Make film when you don't know how to light. Well, he simply said, well, that's interesting. That's interesting. There's a moment where you have, in the day, where you have the least lighting problem. It's noon. No shadows. Okay? So let's make a film that exists in an eternal noon. Okay? So he got Godard, which he got because Godard, he thought, okay, this guy learned how to make film in battle condition, so at least we'll have an image. And they decided that, okay, they were going to do a thing at noon. They put foil on top of the ceiling, and they blasted it with floods, and the light fell straight down, which completely cut any possibility of shadows for the characters. Okay, so the characters suddenly looked like they were stuck, like beautiful butterflies against the wall. Oh, and then if you just put them in primary colors, all these beautiful young boys and girls suddenly having, red shirts and blue pants and that started to look like a fucking Matisse painting. Okay? And if you looked like a Matisse painting, and the scene read like a Matisse painting, and that's the genius of Jean-Luc, because you're forced to look at it like a Matisse painting, and you can never tell yourself, oh, this is an imitation of Matisse. The Cretans came after. Cretans like Wim Wenders who think that it's great when you make a frame that looks like a painting. It's as if the problem was for the thing to look like a painter. Name it. Hopper, an expressionist over there. Jean-Luc never did that. He made things that functioned like a painting. Entered the whole narrative process in that. Of course, he felt guilty about it. And he moaned, oh, I can't tell a story. Why should I tell a story? And it worked. It was splendid. I mean, the guy was lucky as hell. And you call that luck to put an ad in a paper saying, young and talented filmmaker is looking for a young and beautiful actress to be the star of his movie and possibly his mistress. And the first person that knocks at your door is Anna Karina. You've got to be a cuckold. I mean, this is amazing as luck. But, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was wondering why you have a hard time about shooting, and is it because that you also see yourself getting trapped in this whole ideology of the close-up yourself? Because it's so powerful, and that you prefer then to try to undermine that and do a critique by separating yourself from it.
I think in some ways a state of doubt and diffidence from myself to myself. I mean, to be a good filmmaker, I think you have to be essentially, as I said yesterday night, you have to be a great rebounder. And there's that the shooting. I mean, this is purely psychological. There's a kind of petrifying aspect, where I always feel like I'm not going to be smart enough to rebound fast enough. The fact of having to deal with that many people on the, and a kind of sense that I suspect I was really, this idea that ultimately, a kind of experience that I've had is that every time I've had in a film, and that has happened to me quite a lot, that I overworked at the shoot, or even at the shoot, without overworking it, I had something that at the dailies, people would stand up, people of the crew would stand up and applaud, and it was great, and it looked great, and those scenes that looked great and seemed great, etc., were absolutely like moments where the entire editing would just slam the brakes. I think it's a very simple thing. If somebody brought you a poem and said, "Look, this is the first word of my poem. Isn't that great?" You would say, "Well, let's have a page. We'll judge." I think that the problem of the image of cinema, which is a very complex image, is that it's essentially an art of the disappearance. It's not an art of the appearance. That's what it's radically different from painting or from photography. So how do you organize an image whose existence is its disappearance, which existence and power is the fact that it ultimately leads to another image? How do you construct a visual system whose function is to leak in such a way that it creates the need for another image? And this is absolutely radically against everything that we know in terms of the establishment of an image. And so in some ways for fear, because I'm essentially an editor, and for fear to have images which were so constructed and so thought that they would block that process, I tend to think that, and in part it's also, to be honest, it's the fact that I've always been poor. I've always been poor, so I've always been obliged to work with very little. So I have a tendency to say, okay, I'll do the gesture, and it's kind of ridiculous to think that the gesture in and of itself should achieve more than it can achieve. So I have a tendency not to be really that bothered by the kind of shitty quality of the stuff that happens at the shooting. I tend to be diffident for things to gel,
your character is very much of an engager, and it seems that the complexity of a shooting situation would actually be stimulating.
I'm not paralyzed at the shooting. I'm very active. I engage the actors and the people. I create all sorts of situations. But that's it. And when I do that once, twice, 3 times, I think I've got enough to build something on top of it. And I'd rather leave myself the possibility of adding to something than trying to perfect something within its own logic. I'm essentially constantly trying to, one of the advantages of being poor is that at least you better use that freedom. So in some ways, and it's part of the stuff, I think that the practice of editing in the case of Godard, which I come from, in so many ways, it's really a painterly practice. So it's about strokes, it's about layers. So the question for me is always, how many layers can I bring in? So I have a tendency to think that any material is in some ways a base.
So do you see that in terms of the economy that's presented today because of the digital as being?
No, I think the digital is really changing the nature of the game in many ways. There are several things. I think where digital editing really plays a trick on editors, because the capacity to do endless cuts very fast tend to take out of the kind of urgency. When I work in film, it takes so long to undo what you set up that you tend to set up with more purpose. And I think that's a problem. But also, it tends to transform radically the modes of shooting. People shoot. It's not the same thing to think about a scene in which You know, I mean, in film, 16 millimeter, you had 400 feet. That's 11 minutes of shooting max for a scene. You know, if you shot it kind of continually, 5 minutes if you're in 35. Okay, so you were functioning within units of 10 to 5 to 10 minutes. Now, to me, to conceive it when you have 1 hour possible to meander inside of a scene, it's a radical transformation of the idea of shooting a scene, of its dramaturgy, of the way the actor functions, of the relationship to the language, of the relationship to the space, etc., etc.
Doesn't the documentary side of absorbing what is in front of you become then even more of a substance that you could touch because of this availability of the digital shooting even more than digital editing? Because now,
yeah, I think in some ways it's possible, but you know, I would say few people are Wiseman, who I think is a great documentarist, even if it's completely the opposite of my church. And there are more people in his church than in mine, more part of a sect. But
could you talk about that, like how you distinguish your perspective from a Wiseman, in as much as you are also so involved?
I never shoot more than my ratio is 1 to 3 at the max. You know, I conceive the stuff and I shoot 1 to 3. I shoot systematically as a poor fiction filmmaker. You know, I mean, Wiseman shoots 1 to 40, or 1 to 50, or 1 to 60. Yeah, you have to be part of an institution to do that. Even if you, I'm leaving? Okay, let's go.
I just want to say, I think we have to stop because Jean-Pierre actually has to catch a plane, and we want to have a brief break, 15-minute reception up on the 3rd floor of this building. If you go all the way down the hall and turn left, you'll find it, and you can follow a group of people who are going there. Then we'll come back at 4:30, 4:35, so you can introduce this very rare screening of Routine Pleasures, and then grab his bags and run.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to go. I'm shooting tonight in Tijuana. It's been something that's been set for forever. I have to do it. Okay, my film are worth you seeing in it. Okay, that's all I'm trying to say. Even if I meander in all sorts of directions, I generally start taking flight after 3 hours of talk. So we haven't even reached the moment I become cogent. On top of that, I didn't sleep a wink during the entire night. And for some reason, the Cahiers du Cinéma forced me to, ask me. I'm supposed to be the series of articles published on my work in this month's issue, and they wanted an interview of me where they asked me questions like, what do you think of American television? You must. I don't have a TV. So I've been forced to look at nonstop at things like The Sopranos and Millennium and The X-Files and Friends. And so I spent the entire night looking at The Sopranos, and I'm just like. And the thing which totally baffles me is that intellectuals, and they're creating fucking departments around this shit. Intellectuals think that it's really hard to think about popular culture, when in fact the one thing that you don't have to think about is popular culture, because it tells you about itself, everything. It exists in a state of complete transparency and redundancy, so you don't have to say anything about it. And those guys are asking me to think about this shit.
They fell out. They just like
You just slide into somebody's tunnel. I mean, I really think that. So just be
silent. He's the guy who gets in
This is a film about. If you hear me, I'll just. It's a film that was shot twice. I didn't like the way it looked once, so I shot it again completely. So second time around. It's the second volume of that Southern California trilogy. So the first, and I mean, in all the three, there's a constant, which is language. But the first one was basically landing. That's Polo and Cabango, which is the film where everybody talks funny. And the second one is about this moment where you ask yourself as an immigrant, how much inside is inside. And essentially, I think that the film, I wanted to do a film that, as a European, when you come to the States, which is what this film explores all the time, you suddenly discover that you've entered a strange place, which do not function on the same axis like the one you function on as a European. And as a European, or not only European, but in all sorts of parts of the world, the axis you function on is the axis of time. You think in before and afters, and you think on the axis of time because you're so conscious of the segmentation of the history of the space in which you live. And I think that the one thing that happens when you enter the States, you suddenly realize that you're forced to think on the axis of space, and that it's not the same thing to think about a love affair and to say that you exist before or after the love affair turned bad, and to think that you're east-west, north-south of a love affair, the same pattern. Basically, I'm putting fancy words on the reality. If you're a European and you hit the States, you're suddenly forced or compelled to do a road movie. Many aspects of the road movie, and in a way, the film should be seen as the antithesis of Paris, Texas, of Wim Wenders. Generally, people who tend to do road movie go into spectacular places, and exotic people enter the frame of the road movie. I'm more perverse than that. If you ask me to do a road movie, I'll put my camera on 5mm of road, and I'll see the cockroaches passing on the stuff. So it's a road movie that doesn't move. And it corresponds to my situation, which is a lot of my friends, given the fact that I've been this golden boy in Paris, were asking themselves why the hell I'd come to the States, and of all the places in the States, why the hell did I choose to be in San Diego? And they would have understood New York, they would have understood Los Angeles even, they would certainly have understood San Francisco, but San Diego was completely beyond their comprehension. So I felt compelled to explain why in some way I was there. But then outside of this one level, of these two levels, there's another, which is one of the questions that since I made film was always asked from me is, and I think it's asked from any filmmaker, is what is your film about? What is the film about? So I decided to make a film which was about.
I needed to construct a machine that had so many levels and moved in so many different ways that you never knew where it was going to get you. So it's a very Deleuzian film. It's a very much a kind of rhizomatic organization. There is a meditation on two things. On one end, these guys who are model railroad enthusiasts, and that's another level of the film. That's one of the other about which is that I was always interested in passion. Why? Because passion is an absolute, is a tough nut to crack. And it's a trap as a filmmaker. If you're trying to understand what makes someone tick, what's that passion is about, if you interrogate the obsessed looks at you with a bemused smile. I mean, how could you not understand the reason of my obsession? The obsessed is not someone who's capable of explaining the order of his obsession. So what happens is a trap. In order to understand that thing that constantly refuse itself to your grasp, like the experience of, in some way, the inside constantly refuse itself to the grasp of the immigrant, you're obliged to suddenly show your own passion, your own obsession at tracking that obsession. So it's not only a tough nut to crack, it's a nut that never gets cracked and forces you in the open. So that's that mechanism that interested me. Why the trained people? Several things. They had constructed this landscape, which allowed me the road movie that never moved, which is said in the film, the possibility of an epic film with a shoebox. And we presented this kind of, you'll see, this kind of rather extraordinary display in which they function. And it occurred to me, which is part of the film, but one of the essential element of the American pathos is the notion of miniaturization. That there is so much space around that in some ways you have to phantasmatically reduce that space. You have to miniaturize it, as opposed to what you have to do in Europe, which is to enlarge it. So I was interested in that because effectively when you look at landscape painting in the States, or when you look at all sorts of miniaturization production, it touched that kind of aspect. So it's a strange film, which thinks a lot, like I do, which is in some ways totally devoid of the kind of drama that the first one had, which is about cute little girls and seduction, which is also something that interested me. And at the end of it, and is also, so I took that, which is those guys and their practice, and I took something else that I put in the film, because in fact, as is said in the film, when you want to indicate to someone where you are in the landscape, you do this. And here, meaning by that, two series of things, two lines intercrossing at one point, which can be of completely different nature. So the film is that. It's that gesture. So blah 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 blah. There's plenty in that film. And of course, the other element that came in was to put next to those guys, artists in the low mode, to put somebody who was in the high mode, which is somebody who had enormous influence on me as a thinker, as a writer, as a painter, was my friend Manny Farber. It was in fact the reason why I stayed in San Diego. Manny, who included me in in one of his 10 principles of criticism, called me a twin brain, which is something that I was very proud of, and I should have never taken so literally. So, there's all this text and subtext. It's a film which is entirely to subtext. It's a declination of the word subtext. I think it's a great film. Some people can think it's utterly boring, but it's really something that I did that really doesn't resemble to anything done prior. And thank God, ever since, because it's so ingrained. You'll see. It's a print that it's not going to look that completely great, and I hope it's not going to break in 1,000 times, 1,000 pieces, but I hope you enjoy that stuff, and I will humbly disappear in the dark. I'm going to look at 5 minutes of it, and then make some noise and I'll disappear.
Thank you.